Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, Barter Hordes. My name is Robert. Happy Friday. Happy summer solstice if you're in this hemisphere, or happy winter solstice if you're in the other hemisphere. It's been a pretty productive week reading, although it's been kind of a mixed week in terms of my enjoyment of the things that I've read. I finished 4 books this week. 2 of them have been going on for a little while, so I didn't read them entirely this week. And then the other 2 were pretty much one-week reads. So I'll just take you through those 4 in the order that I finished them. The first one was Hazards of Time Travel by Joyce Carol Oates. This is one of the original 48 books in our field of competitors for the BookTube Prize. It did not make it to the second round, the quarterfinals, and I still have about 6 or 7 of the books from the original 48 to read, and I'm gradually making my way through those final 6 or 7, one a week or so. This is my first Joyce Carol Oates novel, and a lot of people who have read much of her work have said it's probably not very typical of some of her other novels. It's the story of a woman who's 17. She is her high school valedictorian, and at the rehearsal for the commencement exercise, she is arrested for essentially for thought crimes. It's got some very clear resonances with 1984. Her speech was really just a series of questions that she wanted people to answer. And so she's arrested, and she is sent into exile for 4 years. But exile in that society is via time travel. She is sent to a smallish, well, 10,000 students, 9,000 students, a smallish liberal arts college, one of the University of Wisconsin campuses in Wayne, Scotia, Wisconsin. But she's sent to the year 1959. Now, in her society, it's a newly constituted American states. They call themselves the NAS, and they date their calendar from the 9/11 attacks. So this starts off in NAS 23, or 23 years after the 9/11 attacks. So not that far into our future. And she's sent for 4 years to live in exile and go to school at this college. And while she's there, of course, she manages to meet some other people who are probably in exile as well. The first half of this book I really enjoyed. The setup, the concept, the premise, all of that really made a lot of sense to me, and I like Joyce Carol Oates' writing style. But I just thought the second half just lost the plot completely. It got off into this rambling discussion of psychological theory because she takes psychology courses, and the guy she falls in love with, who is also in exile, is one of the young professors at the University of Psychology. And it goes off onto all these different tangents and doesn't really resolve itself very well. And so ultimately I found it pretty disappointing, although I was really encouraged by the first half. It's as if it just changed directions in the second half and became a novel that I didn't recognize. So that wasn't the greatest start to my week. The second book, however, and I mentioned this last week that I was just starting to read this, and it's The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay, who is a youngish writer from Bangalore in southern India. I did this one as a buddy read with my Southern Booktubers crew, Kendra Winchester, Jacqueline of 6 Minutes for Me, and Doris of All the Books. We all wanted to read this one. And this one, almost right from the beginning, captured me as potentially the best book I've read this year. The question was that sustainable? As Doris puts it, will she stick the landing? That kind of thing. Excuse me. And she did. This book is my favorite book so far of 2019. It came out in January and apparently was a Book of the Month Club selection, but very few people have been talking about it. And I don't know if that's because Grove Atlantic dropped the ball on marketing and people just didn't hear about it much, or some other reason, or maybe it's the topic. Excuse me, suddenly I have something in my throat. The story is a first-person narrative told by Shalini, who is 24 at the time of the action. And then she's telling this 6 years after the fact. Now suddenly Scout wants to get in the video. Want to say hi? Want to say hi to the camera? No, you just want head pets. And she's telling her story 6 years after it takes place. And she tells you right in the first page or two that this is a confession. So, given my background with confessional narratives and first-person confessional stories, this book was right up my alley to start with. And it was just magically done. Shalini, her mother dies, and she's pretty close with her mother. Her mother dies. She's a little bit distant with her father anyway, and she's working for a nonprofit, but she's not engaged at all. She actually ends up getting fired from the nonprofit, and she doesn't know what to do with herself. And when she was younger, 11 years younger, a man used to come to their house regularly who was Kashmiri, Bashir Ahmed, and he really didn't sell them much. He was a traveling clothes salesman, but Shalini's mother and Bashir somehow struck a chord up, and he would stay for an hour or two and just tell stories, and they would drink tea. And there was obviously some kind of an emotional attachment between Bashir and Shalini's mother. So when her mother dies, there had been a little bit of a falling out between her mother and Bashir some 4 years before that. Shalini doesn't know what to do, so she wants to find Bashir again because she hasn't heard from him in 4 years. And so she decides she's going to Kashmir, all the way up in the north. And so she goes by herself, completely unprepared for what she might find. And she gets involved with Bashir's family and another family in Kashmir and grows to love the region and love the people. But she never really understands what's going on with the politics between India's army and the Kashmiri people. And she ends up making a lot of things worse, which of course is why she's confessing. And that's all I'm going to say about the plot. But this story, for a debut novel, is just remarkable. You should read this one now. Drop what you're reading, go read this one. It's that good. I've only seen one person who's talked about the book online who didn't really love it. Everybody else that I've talked to has thought it was terrific. I know Sarah from Hardcover Hearts just recently read it after I talked about it last week. She adored it as well. So this is a book that BookTube needs to get out there because it's so deserving of our attention. So anyway, it's The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay, a debut novel that is just terrific. From page 1 to the very end, she had me captivated with her prose, the tightness of her storylines, the way she refers to things that happened in the past, and within a sentence or two, you're right back there again. Just a masterful book. I'm just so impressed with this as a debut novel. So that's my recommendation for the first half of the year. That's my book of the year. The third one I finished was one I've been reading sporadically over the last couple of weeks, and that's How to Read Poetry Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. It's a fairly short introductory guide to the elements of poetry. Some of you who are perhaps English teachers or are young enough that you even had this book assigned to you as a classroom text, remember his book that kind of put him on the map, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Then he published one about how to read novels like a professor, and now he's come out with this one, How to Read Poetry Like a Professor. He's gone into some other books as well, but this series, I think, is just these 3 titles. And I will say, I didn't find this one as useful as his previous 2. That might be because I'm a fiction person and not a poetry person. I don't know. But this one seemed a little bit more, I guess, more idea-based and less practical-based than I would have liked. It was a little bit vague at times, a little artsy-fartsy, when most people who are trying to read poetry for the first time really want some hard and fast, concrete ways to get into a poem, because so many people have misconceptions about poetry. My students, for years, were convinced that there's a magic decoder ring that teachers get when they become teachers for poetry, and that it's all just secret code. And he tries to dispel that myth. And so it's worth reading if you want an introduction to poetry that's not too academic. But don't expect it to unlock all the mysteries. It kind of goes around in circles a little bit. And then the last book that I finished just yesterday, in fact, would have put me into the hugest book slump ever had I been reading it by itself. But I've been reading it for a couple of weeks now because it's 1,000 pages long, and that's Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Now, I'm a Dickens fan. I've liked a lot of Dickens novels. This one just did not work for me, partly because it's 1,000 pages long, and it could probably be just as effective in 300 pages. Dickens wrote this towards the end of his career. It was serialized from, I think it was 1855 to 1857. If you're not familiar with the serialization process back in the 19th century, novels didn't come out all at once. They came out as parts of magazines, and they would write one episode every week or every 2 weeks. And over the course of a couple of years, these novels would come out. And then after it was finished in serialization, the publishers would publish usually a 3-volume full edition of the novel. This is one that Dickens must have been paid by the word because it's just bloated. It's the story of a man named Arthur Clennam who comes home from being overseas, and he suddenly gets interested, not romantically interested, but is just interested in the story of a seamstress who works for his mother. And her name is Amy Dorrit, but everybody refers to her as Little Dorrit. And she lives, Arthur finds out, in the debtor's prison, the Marshalsea debtor's prison. Her father has been at that debtor's prison longer than anybody else there. He's kind of the patriarch of the debtor's prison. And Amy was actually born in that prison and has lived there her whole life with her father. And then the story progresses over a long period of time to include a lot of different storylines. This is classic Dickens in the sense that there are a million characters. Most of them are delineated by a phrase or a gesture, so when they show up again, you get some sense of who they are. But half of these characters just blend together into a mess for me because there's so many characters, and so many of them really don't mean much to the story. So I'm a Dickens fan. This is not one I would recommend to somebody just starting with Dickens. For one thing, it's just too bloody long. I'm going to petition Goodreads. This should count as 3 or 4 books rather than 1 book in my Goodreads challenge. It's just too long. Bloated is the best word for it. So I read 4 books, or I finished 4 books this week. Only one of them was magical, but it was so good that it makes up for the other 3. Read The Far Field. You really need to read it. So what am I reading now? I'm in the middle of 2 books, and I'm starting a 3rd book today. The first one is another one of those 48 BookTube Prize long list titles that I had not read before, and that's The Mars Room by Rachel Kushner. It did not make the quarterfinals, and I'm about 2/3 of the way into it, and I can see why it doesn't. It doesn't hold up very well as a story. It's about a woman who's in prison. She's been sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 6 years. They tagged on 6 years for something. And she's gradually giving you some of the details about her own story, but mostly she's just outlining all the different criminals she knows and what they've done and what their lives were like. And it's just a little bit, I don't know, it's just a little bit much. I know that this book is probably trying to play on the popularity of Orange is the New Black, the TV series. And I enjoyed that series too, but partly because you get to know the individual characters pretty well, and partly because there's some humor. There's not really much humor in The Mars Room, and you don't really get to know any of the characters beyond the surface level. So it's easy reading, it goes fast. I'm glad I picked it up because I've heard a lot about it, but it's not really one that I think is terrific. The other one that I've just started a couple of days ago is a 2019 new release. It's The Song of the Jade Lily by Australian writer Kirsty Manning. It's another one of those historical dual timeline narratives that I actually really like. It's set in 1939 Shanghai. It follows a character named Romy. She's a young Jewish girl from Austria. The book opens on Kristallnacht, and in front of her and her family, her older brother Benjamin is shot in the head right in front of them for trying to help somebody stand back up who had fallen down. And then her other brother, Daniel, has been sent off to Dachau. And at that point, they still think that they can get him out of Dachau, so they're doing a letter writing campaign. But they've had to flee the country. So they have found that they could get to Shanghai, where they couldn't get to the United States or anyplace else. So they ended up going to Shanghai. And so in 1939, the story is about Romy, her mother, who's, of course, miserably depressed, her father, who's a physician, and a friend that she makes on the ship to Shanghai, whose mother dies in childbirth. And so her friend Nina becomes a lifetime friend, and she is an orphan at that point. Her father was killed in a pogrom. And then another friend she makes in Shanghai, one of her neighbors named Li. And so it alternates between that story in Shanghai, and when Romy is much older, it shifts to the story of her granddaughter, Alexandra. They live in Australia. They live in Melbourne. But Alexandra has been working in London. She's a commodities trader, and she's a hotshot. When her grandfather, when Romy's husband starts to die, Alexandra goes back to Melbourne and spends several weeks there as he fades away. And then she picks up and moves to Shanghai for her work. But now that she's in Shanghai, she's starting to try to figure out her own mother's story. Her, or actually, I guess it's her own. It gets a little bit confusing because Alexandra's mother was adopted by Romy. She is Chinese. And so Alexandra is not the blood granddaughter of Romy. It sounds more complicated than it actually is. But she's starting to try to trace down her Shanghai family now that she's living in Shanghai. And so far, I'm only about 150 pages in, and it's really well done. I'm enjoying it a great deal. It's a paperback original. I think it's out from William Morrow. I'm not sure. But that one's worth looking at if you like those kind of dual narratives. So 1939 Shanghai and 2016 Melbourne, and then back to Shanghai. And then the one I'm going to start later today, I've told you about, it was one of my Book Expo picks. And it's The Chelsea Girls by my real life and fictional crush, Fiona Davis. This is Fiona Davis's fourth novel. She writes historical novels about people, but also about New York City. Her first one, for example, was called The Dollhouse. It is about the Barbizon Hotel for Women, and it's a dual timeline. Back when the Barbizon Hotel for Women was first a landmark for models and secretaries and so on, and then in more contemporary times when it goes condo. Her second one is The Address, which is about the Dakota, the famous apartment building. And again, it's a dual timeline, when the Dakota was first opened and then the contemporary time period. Her third one, which was the first one that I found and fell in love with, is The Masterpiece, which is about Grand Central Terminal and the art school that was once housed in the terminal itself. This one is about the Chelsea Hotel. So again, a dual timeline. And the one she's working on now, her fifth one, she apparently publishes one every summer, which I find remarkable given how much research she must do. The one that she's researching and writing now is about the New York Public Library and the fact that the librarian actually had a full suite of apartments in the library itself. And so it's about that family and the library. So that's what I'm going to be starting later today. So getting back to more of my wheelhouse after torturing myself with 1,000 pages of Charles Dickens that I didn't particularly enjoy, which breaks my heart because I really like Dickens normally. I hope you're having a great week and you're on your way to a great weekend. Happy summer, as I said before. It is definitely feeling like summer here. It's been hot. We're getting thunderstorms, typical North Carolina summer weather. I don't have any plans right away to do another book haul. I've only got a couple of books. It's been a slow week for book mail. So unless something remarkable happens today or Monday, I probably will skip a book haul next week and maybe do a tag video instead. So I'll probably see you on Tuesday or Wednesday with another video. Hope you're having a great week. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.